ultimate price. We have never had the appropriate discussions for the dismantling of an imperial order. And whether it is in the United Nations system or whether it is in the multilateral development banks, regrettably, we continue to see first-class and second-class citizens. Bob Marley had a song called War. We would do well to go back and read the lyrics of it, and not just to read them, but to walk the walk and to talk the talk.
After the Second World War, 44 countries, 740, I think 44 delegates sat in a small city called Bretton. The World Bank and IMF did not exist. They created it in 3 weeks. The agreement was done in 3 weeks. Why is it difficult for us? Because there was, the whole of Europe had been destroyed. And so it was urgent and it was important for a decision to be made. Are we saying the crisis that we are going through, including what we just heard from the Prime Minister of Pakistan, is not serious enough for us to agree on a global financing mechanism that sorts out climate change as a problem that is affecting all of us? Are we saying ever since 1945, we have become stupid? Is that what we are saying? Or we have become less human, that we have no more feelings about what's going on?
Quem é que cumpriu as decisões da COP15 em Copenhague? Quem é que cumpriu o Acordo de Paris? Ou seja, e não se cumpre porque não tem uma governança mundial com força para decidir as coisas e a gente cumprir. Se cada um de nós sair de uma COP e voltar para aprovar as coisas dentro do nosso Estado Nacional, nós não iremos aprovar. Então é preciso ter clareza que se a gente não mudar as instituições, o mundo vai continuar o mesmo. Quem é rico vai continuar rico e quem é pobre vai continuar pobre.
The intervention of the rating agencies in our development. Not so long ago, barely 18 months ago, Ghana was the darling boy of the bond markets in the capital market. Suddenly, as a result of rating downgrades that were taken, became shut out of the capital markets. And this has been done by people for whom there's very little accountability. Nobody's able to hold their feet to the fire and find out exactly what is it that motivates them, what are the basis upon which these rating agencies work. We need to be able also to focus on that. But I think that above all, the forward thing is making sure that we ourselves, especially on the African continent, are in a stronger and better place to determine our own future. We have seen that the dependence on foreign capital is both costly and risky. It is not in our control, and it means that at any stage, the rug can be pulled from under our feet. We've seen it recently. We saw it over the pandemic struggle when suddenly it became impossible for us to have access to vaccines.
So climate change is real, no doubt. We're living through it every day. From where I sit, we need, out of this summit, we need two outcomes. Number one, we need to agree on how do we get emergency liquidity, number one. How do we deal with debt that is saddling many developing countries? And how do we get additional money in the context of what Mottley said in the morning, urgency and scale? Those two things we need just to answer. In my very respectful submission, I believe we should not leave this conference until we agree on what we are going to do to get many countries in the global south to at least be in a position to have a conversation by sorting out their immediate issues. And the immediate issues is there is no space for debt anymore. We need to deal with it. We need emergency liquidity in the context of where we are today, coming from the pandemic, getting into the war in Europe and getting into the climate change situation, the many crises we have to sort out. What do we need to do urgently? The proposal I make is we need to reform the multilateral development financing institutions. The international financial architecture is not sitting pretty. UN Secretary General said on this podium this morning that there are countries that are paying 8 times in interest what the rest are paying. He was actually referring to those of us in Africa and largely in the global south. We're paying 8 times. And that is why our being in debt is not by default. We were set up by the system to be in debt. If you are paying 8 times, the chances of you being saddled with debt are 8 times higher than the next person. So how do we get out of this? Our suggestion is that before we leave here, let us agree, let us have a consensus on a win-win. The multilateral development banks have shareholders. Those shareholders cannot allow them to make certain decisions. So it's okay. So how do we keep the shareholders happy? Let us tell them, we will pay our debts. Give us 10 years or 15 years grace period and make the debt a 50-year loan. And we stop paying, we start with not paying the money we are supposed to pay next year. And they give us 10 years. What will happen is immediately the resources that we were supposed to pay for debt servicing become available to us to sort out the immediate issues. I'll give you an
Poverty, climate change. We have already argued that these are intertwined. There's no question about it. Let me draw the first aspect of the connection. Even before we talk about financing, new financing, more financing, when countries are not growing economically, you cannot expect a poor person to carry an additional burden. That is necessary to drive growth, to drive development. So poverty actually exacerbates the climate change mitigation measures.
Last year, we had the most devastating floods as a result of climate change in Pakistan. Largely, the cash amounts had to be generated from our own resources. And when we approached international institutions, they said, well, we can give you loans. But when it comes to the question of saving thousands and thousands of people from dying, then you have to borrow money at a very high cost. Then you have to go and beg and borrow and further deteriorate your already very precarious financial situation.
Beaucoup de pays africains dépensent aujourd'hui plus d'argent pour rembourser leurs dettes que pour les soins de santé, avec des séquelles terribles pour des générations entières. Aujourd'hui, 52 pays sont en défaut de paiement ou se rapprochent dangereusement de cet état. Et cela inclut la majorité des pays les moins avancés, tout comme la majorité des 50 pays les plus vulnérables au changement climatique. Des dizaines d'autres risquent de les rejoindre. Et cette situation est intenable. Il est clair que l'architecture financière internationale a failli dans sa mission de fournir un filet de sécurité global aux pays en développement.
It will help us not to participate as unequal cousins in these institutions. It will help us to participate fully, and so that we don't have a sense that we are beggars, that we are being dealt with out of generosity. I think it's important in the new era that the world is in now that there should be a good measure of equality among sovereign nations.
Prosperity. So as to address this challenge, we need a robust and predictable financial safety net. Without resource, there is no way that we can address this challenge. If we use as entry point financial resources, MDBs must be at the center of this game. They are the main player of this game.
Le système financier international est en crise. À mi-chemin de l'échéance du programme 2030, les objectifs de développement durable s'éloignent chaque jour un peu plus. Même les objectifs les plus fondamentaux en matière de faim et de pauvreté reculent après des décennies de progrès. Oui, en 2023, plus de 750 millions de personnes ne mangent pas à leur faim. Et des dizaines de millions de personnes supplémentaires sont en train de basculer dans l'extrême pauvreté.
Them. Now, I come to promises that have been made. And Chancellor Scholz was saying, we've got to walk the talk. Yes, we want to see the talk being walked. President Sassou Nguesso yesterday said at the dinner, $100 billion was promised per year. And he was saying, I've never seen that. And many of us will testify that that $100 billion has never really been made available. And this should stand out as something that needs to be addressed. Because sometimes we sit at conferences like this and say, yes, we'll make this available, and we believe you. We believe you, but now the tire must hit the tar. We must now see action flowing from that.
2015 كان في قوة دفع كبيرة جدا هنا في باريس لمؤتمر المناخ وساعتها قدر وخصص $100 مليار من جانب الدول المتقدمة لصالح مساهمة منها في على أن ده سيتم تكراره سنويا لصالح المناخ. وده كان أمر جيد جدا. وأنا كل اللي هسأله يا ترى لو إحنا كنا نفذنا $100 مليار لمدة ال7 سنين لمواجهة تغير المناخ، النتائج في هذا الأمر
Il faut qu'on soit juste avec nous pour que les énergies comme le gaz, qui doit être une énergie de transition, puissent cohabiter avec l'énergie renouvelable. Et dans ce cadre, justement, nous allons signer aujourd'hui, en tout cas nous venons d'avoir un accord avec le G7 à travers le JETP, Just Energy for Transition, où le Sénégal s'est engagé à monter à 40% d'énergie renouvelable à l'horizon 2030, donc dans 7 ans. 40% avec un financement de l'ordre de 2,5 milliards d'euros. Nous pensons que si cet argent est mobilisé, nous pourrons atteindre et voire dépasser cet objectif.
South Africa, as most of you will know, we did arrive at a deal, the JETP deal with a number of countries, and we found this to be a pioneering deal, quite historic, in that an amount of $8.5 billion was committed. What we did after making our clear, bold statement, as well as after reaching this JETP deal, and having been offered $8.5 billion in the form of grants, in the form of concessional loans, and in the form of plain vanilla loans, we found that actually we're going to need much more, up to $98 billion, which is far much more than what has been on offer. So therefore, we therefore need access to funding, and the funding has to be innovative. Funding has to increase on the grant size, and also the concessional loans also need to be considerable.
But the Bridgetown Initiative also calls for a significant scaling up of multilateral development bank lending. That is where geopolitics and domestic politics is playing its worst hand. And we have to decide whether we are going to be a prisoner of the horrors of the past, or whether we are going to confront the future with confidence, recognizing that if we don't each give up something, the entire ship will sink. The reality is that the easiest way to get there is through increasing the callable capital in the bank. Whether that can happen rests upon domestic politics and geopolitics. In the absence of it, what I spoke to this morning with respect to finding new sources of capital from multinational corporations is critical. And I'm not talking about a national tax for multinational corporations. I'm talking about multinational corporations leaving a few cents on the table in each dollar of profit to be used to protect global public goods and to go directly to the mechanism that we agree, if it is the World Bank or whichever mechanism, that will manage global public goods.
Mise en place, le modèle du financement mondial n'est pas un modèle adéquat, compte tenu du fait que les règles qui régissent la gouvernance mondiale financière ne sont pas en adéquation avec les besoins des clients des pays. Et compte tenu des règles de fonctionnement, notamment des institutions de Bretton Woods, mais également des banques multilatérales, ces règles ne tiennent pas compte vraiment des urgences en matière d'infrastructure, en matière même de climat. Et je vais donner des exemples très précis. Et donc, il nous faut absolument poser des actes nouveaux et immédiats. Je crois que le secrétaire général de l'ONU l'a dit ce matin. Sinon, on va aller vers d'autres fragmentations, comme il l'a appelé, parce que l'attente est très longue, elle est très difficile pour les pays en développement.
The second thing I would like to tell you is that we're trying to define the vision of the bank as being progressing beyond the poverty, although poverty remains key. But what we're going to say is that our job is to eliminate poverty, but on a livable planet. Mia said today that it's 100 years ago, if we tried working on this, we wouldn't be running to do this in the next 10 years. I'm going to give ourselves a little more time, between 7 and 23. It's still very little time. So time is of the essence, and I think scale is of the essence. So scalability and replicability of what we do is even more important than how many different things.
We're short on subsidies, $1.2 billion. And my appeal at this meeting is close the gap. We are going, Ajay and I are going to Morocco for our annual meetings. First time in half a century, the meetings are on the African continent. we go there, we deliver for Africa. And deliver for Africa means for Ajay to have strong IDA, for the IMF to have strong PRGT. 2, we promise, and I thank you, Emmanuel, you are the person who drove it. We promise that if countries in strong reserve positions have received SDRs, don't need them, they should lend through us and through multilateral development banks to others. The target was set 100 billion. I don't, can I say that, I think Bruno Le Maire is going to announce the, can I announce it? So we meet the target, we do have the 100 billion.
Today, thanks to SDRs, if we were to get, for example, $200 billion, just think of it, allocation to MDBs, that could easily become $1 trillion because of the leveraging factor that we have as a hybrid capital to use that to be able to do that. That's the key. And I've always joked with my sister, Kristalina, about the SDR, that it's called special drawing rights. But if we are able to have hybrid capital and use it and advance Kristalina, all the things that you and I care about, we all care about, health, education, and so on. Maybe we might consider even changing the name of that SDR to supporting development revitalization. It's a different way of SDR, but it works also for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really sorry that we ran out of time.
Pour résumer, l'Afrique a un besoin annuel autour de 170 milliards de dollars pour l'infrastructure. Et il y a un déficit par rapport à la disponibilité des ressources. Et ce qui limite l'accès à ces ressources, c'est justement la cherté des crédits. Et cette cherté est due en partie à la perception du risque et aux assurances qui sont exigées, lesquelles assurances, en moyenne, tournent autour de 12% du crédit. 12%, et c'est upfront qu'on nous exige de lever cet argent, surtout pour ce qui concerne les crédits EXIM et tous les crédits, en tout cas privés. Donc, si on arrive à trouver une solution sur la prime d'assurance, je pense qu'on aura beaucoup aidé les pays en développement dans l'accès aux conditions du marché ou dans le blending finance qui permettra, en tout cas, de mettre plus de ressources sur le compte. Last year, we were here for another financing conference. And a critical decision that we took last year referred to the expansion of the SDR allocations. And the idea was that the countries of Africa would get a greater share, a greater part of that allocation. That didn't happen. The traditional formula was applied. And I think that what that tells us is that whatever it is that we want to propose here, we need also to dial into the details of those proposals so that we have a realistic chance of having the proposals implemented.
Doing something new. It requires protecting the reserve quality status of SDRs, but creating long-term concessional resource for countries. We have to do that prudently. We prove it works. We go from 100 to 200 and then to 300. But I would not rush, because if we undermine the reserve quality status of SDRs by willy-nilly doing something not so good, then we won't see that multiplier impact coming. I hope this clarifies this issue once for all of us.
Let us have a global financing mechanism. Loss and damage will not do it. I'm sorry. It will not do it, because loss and damage is hostage to national interest. No nation is going to give money from its people to sort out a global problem. Let us agree to pay the aviation tax. We have no problem. Let us agree on the shipping tax, and we want to pay. We don't want anybody to pay for us. We want to pay our percentage. It is only when we raise global finances that have no national interest for any particular country or shareholder interest of any person. That is how we are going to sort out this global challenge.
I do think that I heard in this summit very good news. I understand that the Council of the European Union is in favor of the shipping, tax on the shipping industry. That's good. It's an industry who is not paying much tax, a very concentrated one. That's exactly the case of the big companies that are really, in a way, capturing a rent of situation that we should not allow. That should be shared among all the population of the world.
I am not sure that a binding framework like the common framework would have rendered the process quicker or more efficient. The approach for a middle-income country would be to move. If you have a common framework, what happens is we move as fastest as the slowest creditor. So we get tied down. So that's why we're not in favor of a common framework. We were able to create traction with the most committed creditors, raising the general quality and efficiency of the process. Because we are still frustrated by the lack of process. The cost for us, economic and social, has been very high.
We need also then to look at debt for education swaps, debt for health swaps, debt for climate swaps, and we need to use innovative mechanisms as we did last year in our blue bonds in Barbados when we issued a debt for nature swap with the help of the Inter-American Development Bank and the Nature Conservancy, where by reducing the cost of interest, the savings immediately went into a trust to be able to finance the protection of our marine area. How we go forward and whether we choose to do it as debt for climate or, as I've said to Haiti for the longest time, debt for education and debt for health, we need to recognize that there are some instruments that will make this more palatable. In our particular instance, we provided an on-demand guarantee so that if there is a default, the IDB and Nature Conservancy steps in. What that meant is that we were able to get lower interest rates and therefore increase the level of savings that goes to finance the national public good that we are seeking to be able to do without necessarily increasing the level of overall debt.
The challenge we face is so large that we all know that we need to go to the next phase. So we are willing to lead in that regard, using the instrument that you just mentioned in a way that we could scale, increase, distribute the risk in a way that we can get it in the amount we need. And basically, I will give you 3 examples. First example are the debt swaps. We had with Barbados, Nature Conservancy, debt to nature. That was very successful. But recently, we had the largest debt swap with Ecuador Galapagos. And what was the secret? We absorbed the risk, both the IDB with the DFC of the US, giving insurance, political insurance, and together we will be able to offer some assurances that could make available resources for, in this case, Galapagos. But now we're facing demand for debt to climate, debt to education, debt to health. So we need to find a way to replicate, to increase the scale, and we are willing to try with the countries. In addition, we can think about regional approach. So we are now thinking not only regional projects in the Caribbean, but also in the Amazon. The Amazonia Forever is a project where we can benefit from debt swaps for biodiversity, for nature.
La mise en œuvre du nouveau pacte passera par la construction d'une boîte à outils audacieuse et innovante en termes réglementaires juridiques et en ingénierie financière. Dans cette boîte à outils, les instruments financiers existants doivent être améliorés, d'autres créés pour mieux partager les risques et les résultats en tenant compte des facteurs et des contraintes climatiques et environnementales, ainsi que d'autres externalités dans la valorisation et la couverture des risques. Elle comprendra en particulier la monétisation des quotas carbone et des DTS. Plus spécifiquement, le nouveau pacte doit rendre concrète et opérationnelle l'aide prévue par les accords de Paris et de Glasgow en faveur des pays pauvres qui attendent d'être mis en application.
When Sri Lanka was declared bankrupt as a MIC, we were not eligible under the common framework for debt restructuring. We had limited access to concessionary financing, and there was a complete loss of external financing. Therefore, Sri Lanka's response was to take ownership of this program, both for debt restructuring as well as the economic restructuring needed for growth. Then we negotiated our conditionalities with the IMF and the creditors. So it's like we were working on a menu. The argument of what are the items that should get on and what are the items that could be taken off. I think we had agreement actually to about 90% of the items. So we own it as much as the IMF is. Of course, we had two exceptional situations. One is that India came to our help, and that was nearly $4 billion available when no other source of funding was available. Secondly, through the World Bank and the ADB, we went through the process of reverse graduation. So the gain became entitled to concessionary funding. But from the time we declared ourselves bankrupt, it was a delay on bureaucracy on both sides. We delayed, and if we had funding by May, the upheavals of July could have been avoided. But anyway, we had the upheavals of July. We went in immediately as it settled down. By September, we had a staff-level agreement, but it took us another 6 months for agreement to come before we got any monetary assistance. So we undertook significant economic reform that imposed pain on the population, but without any predictability. Now this is the problem we have. And I would say, given the increasing vulnerabilities facing middle-income nations, MIC's access to concessional financing must be viewed from a broader perspective. That is, access to an automatic and time access according to an which should be automatic and timely under an agreed criteria. If you fulfill the criteria. Secondly, I'd agree, President Achad, if I knew we could have done it much faster, I would have told Maldives to invade our country. At least you could have got the money much faster. But
so there are some obvious solutions that we are enjoined to take. The first is ourselves, improving our capacity for self-reliance. And that can only happen if we improve radically our own domestic resource mobilization, i.e., how we can strengthen our tax systems in such a way that we can have the resources increasingly internally to invest in our education, to invest in our health system, to invest in our infrastructure.
Vim aqui para falar que, junto com a questão climática, presidente Macron, nós temos que colocar a questão da desigualdade mundial. Não é possível que, numa reunião entre presidentes de países importantes, a palavra desigualdade não apareça. A desigualdade salarial, a desigualdade de raça, a desigualdade de gênero, a desigualdade na educação, a desigualdade na saúde. Ou seja, nós somos um mundo cada vez mais desigual e cada vez mais a riqueza está concentrada na mão de menos gente e a pobreza concentrada na mão de mais gente. Se nós não discutirmos essa questão da desigualdade, e se a gente não colocar isso com tanta prioridade quanto a questão climática, ou seja, a gente pode ter um clima muito bom e o povo continuar morrendo de fome em vários países do mundo. Não é só na África, não, é na América Latina, é no Brasil.
Pour éviter cette fragmentation, nous devons réformer en profondeur la gouvernance de l'architecture financière internationale pour qu'elle soit plus efficace, plus équitable et plus adaptée au monde d'aujourd'hui. Là aussi, il y a un consensus complet, il faut commencer le travail dès maintenant. Nous avons identifié ensuite 4 principes directeurs pour atteindre cet objectif. Premièrement, aucun pays ne doit avoir à choisir entre la lutte contre la pauvreté et la protection de la planète. Deuxièmement, l'appropriation des stratégies de transition doit être faite par les pays. Il y a des besoins différents, les pays peuvent suivre des voies différentes, qu'il s'agisse d'énergie, de protection des forêts, du climat, de la nature. Troisièmement, nous avons besoin d'un choc de financement avec plus de ressources publiques. Et quatrièmement, nous avons besoin d'un choc de financement avec plus de capitaux privés pour à la fois transformer les économies émergentes et celles en développement pour aller vers nos objectifs, réduction des inégalités et sauver la planète.